Natasha.
Debbie,
Show.
the show.
Welcome to it. Just two patriotic girls.
Learning about the world.
So please, don't take us the wrong way.
Welcome to the show.
So we recently did a video on the Anzacs, and we learned a lot. Now, we had this much information, but we did have some information and knowledge on the Anzacs coming in, but not a lot. If you just missed that episode, go back and give it a watch. It was a pretty daggone good episode, and we plan to do more in the future.
It was. And in that video, one of us, I think it was me, I'm not sure.
Both of us.
Both of us, we made a comment about the hats, and you guys told us that it is called the Slouch hat. So now we know that.
And we thought they were just a really cool looking hat, but you know, either way, they're still a cool looking hat, right? But didn't know they were different and separate from other ones. So we wanted to do a deeper dive. We like to do things that, you know, maybe a little tiny thing that we see a blip in a video we want to learn more about, and we leech onto that and try to grab as much info as we can. So just looking through YouTube, trying to find some content, and the title of this video caught our eye.
It is the forgotten history of the Australian slouch hat.
We want to learn today about the Australian slouch hat. We absolutely do, and we hope you do too. So we're going to dive into this video. Be interested to know if you guys learned something maybe that you didn't know. Please in the comments let us know. And again, just really quickly, this is an American who does this video. And we know we've got a lot of comments about the videos that we've done. Most of them are not from Australian narrators, but even when they are.
Sometimes things are mispronounced. We are learning, and we will try our best to say it correctly.
Well, we try to go back and look up the pronunciations of things anyway. Defer back to one of our first and second videos we did on Aussie content. You know, I did my best. But just know that it doesn't take away from the actual content, the subject matter that we're learning. And they're all trying their best, even though they may fail. Anyway, guys, we hope that you're excited about this episode because we really want to learn about the Australian slouch hat. So let's dive into the forgotten history of it.
This is a hat that is officially called khaki fur felt, or KFF, but it's generally referred to as a slouch hat. And characteristic of slouch hats, it has a wide brim. It's pinned up on one side. This one on the left, though sometimes they are pinned up on the right. And while you would think that the slouch hat is really defined by the characteristic pinned up side, it's actually named for the other side, which slouches down. And the hat is sometimes worn unpinned and would still be called a slouch hat. This particular hat happens to be Australian, which is the army that is most associated with the slouch hat, but the history goes...
I'm sorry for pausing so quickly. So does it, does that side stay up even though it's not pinned?
I think the pin is what keeps it up.
Maybe, but I thought he said it...
I think he said, I don't know, that's a good question. It could be on either side though, right?
Yes.
Which is the army that is most associated with the slouch hat, but the history goes back farther than that.
Talk to us.
The term slouch hat is actually not clearly defined, and the slouch hat can be used to refer to almost any wide-brimmed hat, especially if it's worn at an angle.
Really?
In fact, the familiar hat styles known as tricorns and bicorns, both types of cocked hat, were simply broad-brimmed hats, purportedly first used by the Spanish during the 80 Years' War. Broad-brimmed hats were simple, protected against both sun and rain. Over time, the styles changed as the sides began to be pinned up, usually to facilitate rifle drill. A bicorn is pinned on two sides, and a tricorn on three.
Looks ridiculous.
In using that nomenclature, then a slouch hat could be called a unicorn, because it's really nothing more than a bicorn or a tricorn that's only pinned up on one side.
Okay.
Early examples of a cocked hat pinned on only one side were the Cavaliers of King Charles I during the English Civil War, who preferred a fancy cocked hat pinned on one side, a style that was also sometimes used by the famous French musketeers of the Guard, so colorfully described by Alexandre Dumas. During the Napoleonic Wars, a high black hat pinned on one side was most popularized by the Austrian army.
I'm sorry, I've never seen one quite like the Australian one until he's going back. Even this one here, never seen that before.
No.
But some of the other ones, yes, I can see how they're similar, but I don't know. It's different. It's interesting though. I find this fascinating.
While the design was used by some line regiments, it was most commonly used by Jägers, a term which literally means hunter, but in the military which referred to light infantry, skirmishers, scouts, or riflemen.
Okay.
The Austrians called the hat a Korshut, and the Korshut was usually black with a high crown and a feather cockade.
It's huge.
There was often a brass plaque with a unit designation in the front. It is unclear, however, whether the Korshut inspired the modern slouch hat. In 1852, Lajos Kossuth, a deposed leader from Hungary, visited the United States, where he was greeted with wide acclaim. Kossuth has a complex legacy, but Americans saw him as a fighter for freedom and democratic values. He had hoped to gain U.S. backing for further actions in Europe, but was ultimately unsuccessful. What he did do was tour the nation with a soft, wide-brimmed hat that became rather popular. The Kossuth hat, which was also called a slouch hat, again because of the soft, slouching brim, was commonly used by soldiers on both sides of the U.S. Civil War, although more commonly by the Confederates.
Oh, that's true.
The Civil War slouch hat was only rarely worn with a side pinned, however, and the term was used to refer to almost any hat that wasn't a capey, or at least any with a brim all around.
And have you seen those in Civil War photos? Because I don't recall them.
Not a lot, but I guess I do recall vaguely seeing.
You said the Confederacy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and see, my family, thank God, fought for the Union side. Debbie knows a lot about the American Civil War. I know quite a bit too, but she knows a lot more.
A bit more. So I think I have seen them. It's just, I guess I just didn't recognize it and I didn't know what they were called.
Okay,
fair enough.
The term was used to refer to almost any hat that wasn't a capey, or at least any with a brim all around, even if the brim was not particularly wide. Separately, the official U.S. infantry dress hat at the beginning of the Civil War was a high-crowned, wide-brimmed black felt hat commonly called a Hardee hat, after William J. Hardee, who had been commandant of cadets at West Point. The Hardee hat was pinned on one side to allow rifle drill, on the right side for cavalry and artillery, and on the left for infantry. The hat had a wool cord whose color denoted branch of service. The Hardee hat was worn by both sides during the war, and Hardee himself served with the Confederate Army.
You remember that, right?
However, the hat was considered hot and uncomfortable and not widely worn. One notable exception, however, was the Iron Brigade, comprised of soldiers raised in the western states of Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. The Iron Brigade wore uniforms more closely resembling the dress uniform than most other Union regiments. That uniform included the Hardee hat, which by some stories was originally issued in error, but adopted as it gave the brigade a unique look. And the tall crown made the soldiers look taller and more imposing. The brigade was, in fact, sometimes called the Black Hat Brigade because of the Hardee hat, although it purportedly was given its more famous name by Major General George McClellan, whom, after seeing them pushing back Confederate forces at the September 1862 Battle of South Mountain, remarked that they must be made of iron. The Iron Brigade distinguished themselves throughout the war, but particularly so at the Battle of Gettysburg. Although the Hardee hat was never apparently called a slouch hat, its design was actually much more similar to a modern slouch hat than the hats that were called slouch hats during the Civil War.
Interesting.
The use of the slouch hat continued into the Indian Wars, where slouch hats were regulation wear for both officers and enlisted men, although the hat was only very occasionally seen worn with one side pinned up.
I was going to say, I don't see anything like that there.
Which, in the form of a Stetson cowboy hat, is still often seen worn as unofficial headgear for air cavalry units, carried over into the war with Spain, where the hat was famously worn in the traditional slouch hat style, with the left brim pinned up by the commander of the United States 1st Volunteer Cavalry. But again, it's not clear whether the modern slouch hat was derived in any way from these other military designs, because, in fact, it's a really simple design that's very practical, especially in hot or jungle climates. And in fact, the hat that is most associated with Australia today was imported from Asia.
What?
Australia
Hold
got
on, no, I'm mad. Why can't we have a connection? Why can't it be like, it's directly from America? We want that connection with you.
That would be nice.
It'd be cool. Okay.
Well, let's see how
it's interesting, though, to go back and hear this about the Civil War and stuff. Like, I don't remember seeing those. They weren't commonly pinned up like he said.
Right.
So, yeah, it definitely kind of went over or under my radar, I guess you could say.
Well, I mean, me personally, I wasn't paying all that much attention to their hats, per se. I was looking more at their uniforms. And I guess.
But when we watched the Anzac video, it was like, whoa, those hats are cool. And
well,
you said
because
it first,
everybody had them, and they were pretty awesome.
That's true. That's true.
Was imported from Asia. Australia got its iconic hat from an officer named Thomas Price, who was born in Tasmania and served with the British Indian Army in the 1860s. During his service with the Indian Army, he was seconded as a police superintendent in Burma, where the police used a simple wide-brim hat pinned up on one side. Some police units in India still utilize the slouch hat today. Price recognized the simple utility of a slouch hat. He retired in 1883 with the rank of lieutenant colonel and settled in the colony of Victoria in Australia. The colony had a small, semi-professional defense force that was separate from the British Army. He was given a commission in the Victorian military force and in 1885 raised a regiment of mounted rifles. Raised from rural areas of Victoria, the Victorian mounted rifles required recruits to bring their own horse.
Really?
With the Victorian mounted rifles, Price brought the idea of light horse, quickly mobile infantry, well suited for the defense of a frontier, to the military in Australia. While Victorian forces at the time generally wore a blue uniform, Price got permission to uniform the mounted rifles in khaki, a movement that was gradually being adopted throughout the empire.
Oh, that's where that comes from. I was curious about that. Okay. I mean, I've always known that color with Australia, and I did not know where it came from. Did you know? It's okay if you did or didn't. I'm just curious.
I know.
I didn't know.
Just learning.
I think it's fascinating.
Included in that uniform was the slouch hat, an idea borrowed from his days in Burma and a design that would eventually come to characterize the armed forces of Australia. In December 1890, the military commanders of the then separate Australian colonies prior to the Federation of Australia agreed that all Australian forces, with the exception of the artillery, would wear the slouch hat. It was to be looped up on one side, Victoria and Tasmania on the right, and the other colonies, later states, on the left.
How cool.
The reason
That's cool to learn.
That's really, I know,
So
that
there
little,
is a difference between left and right.
that little nugget right there.
Yep.
Little nugget that is
Exactly.
cool. I got you.
Thank you.
and Tasmania on the right, and the other colonies, later states,
Now we got to point
on the left.
Notice those.
The reason for pinning on different sides had to do with the various rifle drills used, as the pinning was generally for the purpose of slinging a rifle without knocking off the hat. In October 1889, long-standing tensions and conflicts over the control of resources and mines boiled over into the Second Boer War between the British Empire and the two Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The Boers initially had an advantage in that British troops in South Africa were largely infantry, while the Boers were natural horsemen, making the Boer commandos highly effective, like cavalry. The mobility of their cavalry, as well as their high-quality Mauser rifles and their skilled marksmanship, contributed to their initial success in the conflict. While Britain was slow to realize how many troops would be needed in the largest and deadliest of the Victorian wars, they quickly recognized the need for mobile units to counter the Boers. While many of these units were recruited from South Africa, Australia offered an obvious solution as well. The climate and terrain of Australia was similar to that of South Africa. Much like the Boers, many Australians were recruited from rural areas where they were skilled at horsemanship. And thanks to Colonel Tom Price, Australia had a regiment of highly skilled light cavalry. And also thanks to Tom Price, those regiments were largely equipped with slouch hats.
And a lot more.
Price himself served in the war, commanding the 2nd Victorian Contingent between 1900 and 1902.
Okay.
At the outbreak of hostilities, Britain was already calling for volunteers from Australia, including the New South Wales Lancers.
Really?
The Lancers were actually in training in England when the war started and were among the first troops to arrive in South Africa. Australian units and local South African units, including Australian volunteers, were largely either like
Sorry, let's go back to that for a minute.
Australian units and local South African
I can't get it in frame just the way
units,
I want
including
it. Right there.
There it is.
That's awesome.
I know, that's an awesome uniform.
I mean, everything about that. The horse, the hat, the uniform, and just the guy's face. First of all, very good-looking gentleman. Hi. That is just that's a cool dude right there. And I didn't say this at the beginning. We totally screwed up. Thank you for your service. Anyone watching that's veteran or active duty, we appreciate you so much. I hope you know that. But that's just a badass photo right there. I mean, geez.
And I really like the slouch hats when they have the big feather plume coming out the side. Yeah, I think it looks pretty cool.
I just think this whole video is fascinating. It's more than just hats. You know, it's so much more than what we, I didn't know what it was going to be about other than the history of the hat. But this has so much more information down to the color of the uniform, the khaki color, which, again, mind-bogglingly cool in the whole different sides, like we were saying, and just different parts of the world that use similar hats. I just think this is really neat. Hopefully you're enjoying it too.
Australian volunteers were largely either like cavalry or mounted infantry. They were highly effective in the Boer War, where their bushcraft, marksmanship, and horsemanship made them an effective counter to the Boers. Australians played significant roles, both in the defeat of the Boer armies in the field and the bloody guerrilla war that followed. While the Second Boer War was the place where the distinctive slouch hat became associated with Australian forces, the style was more widely used, for example, by units from New Zealand, which also fielded almost exclusively mounted rifle units in the conflict.
Okay, cool.
Canadian mounted infantry, like the Canadian Mounted Rifles and the Royal Canadian Dragoons, and was common for both colonial units, such as the British South Africa Police and the Bushveld Carbineers, which was recruited from him in South Africa, but was nonetheless made up of about 40% Australians. The slouch hat was also used by British units. You either saw the design's utility or were issued slouch hats because there was a shortage of standard cork British pith helmets.
Really?
Oh.
Two British units, the Royal East Kent Mounted Rifles and the Imperial Yeomanry, retained the slouch hat for brief periods following the war, although their use had been discontinued by British units before the Great War.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
For their part, the Boers, who did not typically wear standard uniforms, very often wore soft, wide-brim hats, sometimes pinned on one side in the slouch hat style. By the coming of the Great War, slouch hats were a standard part of the Australian uniform for the more than 420,000 Australian troops who served. New Zealand cavalry units also used the slouch hat, although New Zealand infantry was instead issued the similar campaign hat. But Australia wasn't the only army using the slouch hat. The Imperial German Schutztruppe, or Colonial Protection Force, that protected colonies in Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, used a pith helmet, but also wore slouch hats as an alternative,
Really?
as did German colonial police. Thus, the slouch hat was common in the Africa theater. The German slouch hat was pinned relatively high on the right side and was famously worn by the charismatic commander of German forces in the East Africa campaign, Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, popularly called the Lion of Africa.
That just doesn't look right.
In
No,
a
it
unique
doesn't.
piece of history, the slouch hat was favored by Irish volunteers during the 1916 Easter Rising, an armed insurrection by Irish Republicans intended to establish an independent Irish
Yeah,
republic.
I know that one.
The uprising lasted 6 days, resulted in nearly 500 deaths. Although the rising itself was put down quickly, the British response and subsequent actions shifted public opinion away from home rule. The rising was seen as the beginning of the Irish Revolutionary period. The hat was again worn by Australian troops as well as other Allied troops in the China-Burma-India theater in the Second World War. The hat was standard issue for soldiers of the Dutch East Indies Army and
thing has
similar
been
Terai hat or Gurkha hat,
Yeah, it has.
which is
A
not
Gurkha
worn
hat,
pinned up but is worn at such an angle that the hat touches the right ear and thus is notably slouched, is traditionally worn by troops from Nepal called Gurkhas.
We love the Gurkhas. We did a video on them too that was awesome. So what I'm understanding is you could call a lot of things a slouch hat based on the slouching of it, right? And the wide brim. But the pinned up one that the Australians wore, to me, is the coolest one. I mean, it just is.
It looks the most natural.
Yeah, I would agree.
Is notably slouched, is traditionally worn by troops from Nepal called Gurkhas. Both the Terai hat and the more traditional slouch hat were used by the Long Range Penetration Group under General Ord Wingate in the Burma theater, popularly called the Chindits, and was also informally used by American troops in the theater, such as OSS Detachment 101 and the 1st Air Commando Group.
Didn't know that.
The slouch hat is still worn as a ceremonial headdress for units of the Australian Army, Air Force, and occasionally Navy,
That's so
as well as
cool.
for general duties for some regiments. Today, the hat is worn pinned up on the left for ceremonial dress, but with the brim down for general duties. The hat has a distinctive unit color patch, a patch of colored cloth that represents a unit on the right, and a corps or regiment badge placed on the front.
Very neat.
The hat has a puggaree or cloth wrap.
That's cool.
The puggaree originated in India and has the purpose of insulation.
Okay.
Historically, the color of the puggaree has been used to denote unit identity or branch.
Fascinating.
The current
Good to know.
Australian slouch hat has 7 folds in the puggaree, 6 to symbolize the 6 states, and the 7th represents Australia's territories.
That's cool.
Some Australian cavalry units still also wear an emu feather pinned with the fold.
Emu. Thanks for
There you
teaching
go.
us that. Thanks for teaching us that.
The feather harkens back to the First World War, when light horsemen would chase down an emu on horseback and pluck a feather from them. Proof
Thank
of
you.
exceptional horsemanship. One interesting thing about the Australian sun hat is that they have this badge on the side where it's pinned up.
Oh, yeah.
This is called the Rising Sun Badge, but it's actually called the General Service Badge. And the General Service Badge changed over time. So by looking at the General Service Badge, you can get a guess on the age of the badge and the age of the hat.
Oh,
so for
okay.
example, this General Service Badge says Australian Military Forces, which means it came after 1949. Prior to that, it would have said Australian Commonwealth Forces.
Okay.
But there's also a crown on the badge right here, and this particular crown is the St. Edward's crown, not the King's crown,
Oh,
which means
okay.
that this hat was made at least after 1954,
Pretty
because
neat.
that crown was changed in 1954 to celebrate the coronation of Queen Elizabeth,
Yep.
which happened in 1952.
That's cool.
And all that tells me that this is a badge that was used somewhere between 1954 and 1969, and that fits with what it says inside the hat, where there's actually a label that says that this was made by the Dunkerley Limited Company in 1956, size 6 and 7/8, which means that this particular hat came into service just a little bit too late to have served in the Korean conflict.
Gotcha.
Okay.
The slouch hat has a long and storied history. It's treated with great respect in Australia,
As it
and
should
is
be.
a reminder of the distinguished history of the Australian military. Its iconic design is born of practical value, still used by various police forces, usually in tropical climates.
Okay.
It is still used by the U.S. military today for female drill sergeants in the Army and Air Force.
Did you know that?
I
didn't know
did
that.
not.
I've never seen that before
No.
in the U.S.
No. No.
What?
But now we do.
Now I'm going to pay attention more. It's okay. You never know what you're going to learn here.
No.
No collection of military headgear would be complete without an Australian military slouch
want
hat,
one now.
and I am proud to be a steward of this historical artifact.
Come here, hat,
Yeah.
sir.
That was super fascinating.
There was a lot to unpack in that
That
episode.
was.
And I can't unpack it all because, holy crap, man.
Yeah.
Learned a lot about our own history there
We did?
that I thought I would have already known. But how many different wars and stuff. And I like that end part with the metal on the side.
Yes.
Now, is that currently, couldn't see from the one view that he was showing of a more current photo. I didn't see one of those on that. So I don't know if they're still, let's bring it back to that part. Still doing that or not? Oh, it looks like there is some form of a metal on the side.
Yeah.
I can't see what it is and what it shows, but
Yeah.
I would assume now, well, no, I would assume wrong because they still use St. Edward's crown for King Charles's coronation. So let us know in the comments if any of your family have served, if you yourself have not, and if you have one, like of your dad's, grandfather's, that would just be
Yeah. Is that something you cherish? in your
absolutely
family? Yeah.
what a memento to keep and honor.
I thought it was really interesting to learn, one, like you said earlier, how many other countries have used it in their uniforms.
Sort of. Some,
In a way, I mean, I'm glad Australia adopted it as their uniform,
Yeah.
their hat. I mean, it looks great with the rest of your uniform.
Yeah.
I liked learning about the different folds and,
Yeah, that was really neat.
the band that goes around.
Yeah.
And knowing that they have a little bit more symbolism to them
There's
than
a
what
lot
we
of
originally thought.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Yes.
symbolism to those. And that's what's so cool. I love history. I love learning about it, and I just think it's so, I don't know, it's just so interesting and fascinating to me. But there was a lot here,
There
a lot
was.
more than I thought. And I would be really, again, let us know if you learned anything. I'm really curious. And if he left anything out, that would be important for us to know because we always learn from you guys in the comments and we appreciate your comments.
Yes, we do.
So I just really enjoyed this a lot and would like to look more into military stuff. If you have suggestions, please, leave them in the comments and we'll see what we can find.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll see you again next time. Until then, please love like jazz.
Be as strong as Tyson.
Bye, guys.
Bye.